In Unit 7, we're going to look at the discipline process. Often when we think of discipline, we think of consequences or punishment that is dealt out to our learners for not behaving well. But that really should be our very last resort. Each teacher should have a discipline process or guideline that they follow to help learners correct their poor behavior before you get to the stage where you're handing out consequences. So let's look at a sample discipline process. And this can vary from teacher to teacher because you need to find what's going to work for you and your learners. So when poor behavior is noticed, the first step is to give a behavioral reminder. This is some cue to prompt the learners to follow classroom rules. So this should be done quickly without taking time away from teaching and learning. It could be something as simple as going to go and stand behind the learner who is misbehaving, and your presence there should let the learner know that you're aware of what they're doing, and this should usually stop the behavior. It could also be a double tap on the learner's desk. You can come up with your own signal with each learner or that learner or learners that tend to be more commonly disruptive to let them know that they've gone off task and they need to focus and come back. If this does not work, you then need to decide on two different routes. You need to look and see if the learner needs an academic adjustment. Often, when learners misbehave, it's because they've finished their work, or they find it too difficult, or they need a resource like a textbook. Alternatively, you can make an environmental adjustment. And you do this if you believe that the disruptive behavior is due to the distractions around them. You could move learner away from where they're sitting, and if they fiddle with everything in their pencil box, then perhaps move the pencil box. If they are rocking on their chair, perhaps take the chair away for a moment. Possibly get them to do their work standing up. The next step is to give a warning. Now, I included this in the process because many teachers use warnings as part of their discipline process. But they need to be careful because if it's used ineffectively, it can cause the teacher more trouble. So you need to remember at this stage, your warning should be a statement that is given to the learner that if their disruptive behavior continues, there will be consequences. So therefore, that leads us to our last step, which is your consequence. If the learner still, after giving a behavioral reminder, has not adjusted their behavior, you then move on to providing either an academic or environmental adjustment. If the learner continues their disruption, you could give a warning if you would like to. It's optional, or you move on to the consequence. When it comes to deciding on your discipline strategy for your class, it is important to remember that there are three elements to consider. Firstly, there is prevention. And these are the systems that you put in place in your classroom to prevent poor behavior and disruptions from occurring. Secondly is intervention. And these are the strategies or actions taken to ensure that the poor behavior is acknowledged and self-corrected by the learner. Here you are letting the learner know that you are aware of their behavior, but you do not want to create a scene and distract from the learning and the teaching. And the last strategy is innovation. This is the stage where you need to take action and decide on a discipline course or a consequence to give the learner. And because each consequence should be unique to each learner, you need to be creative and innovative to make it a logical and effective consequence. So let's take a look at the ideas that fall under these different strategies. For preventative measures, you could come up with a code of conduct for the class, and it's always better to include your class in this. Don't hand the rules out. Ask them to help you create the rules for the class. You need to establish routines and procedures, so learners know what is expected of them and when. And lastly, you need to consider your classroom layout so that you prevent congestion and possible disruptions from occurring. For intervention, you need to do more constant monitoring of your learners. If they feel that you are keeping an eye on them, they are more likely to behave and stay on task. When a disruption does take place, remember to give the positive behavior you want to see. Thank the learner and then pause and wait. So for example, if a learner is talking to the boy behind them in the line, instead of saying, "Leroy, please stop talking," you could say, "Leroy, face the front, thank you." And then wait for him to do so. You have given the behavior you want to see, and by saying thank you, you have indicated that he needs to follow this command. And by pausing, you tell the learner you're waiting until he complies. So lastly, for innovation, and as it was mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all consequence. Each situation is unique, and you and the learner need to devise a plan together. Remember, when you are dealing with the whole class, you apply your preventative strategies, what you can do to prevent unnecessary disturbances from occurring. As much as we'd all love a classroom with no disruptions, it doesn't happen that way. And here's where you'll land up using your intervention strategies, but probably only on about 25% of the learners, who are your constant offenders, if I can call them that. And remember, your intervention strategy should not distract from your teaching and learning process, but should quickly nip the poor behavior in the bud. And lastly, you will use your innovation strategies on give or take about 5% of the learners in your class. And remember, you need to be creative, caring, and firm. You need to devise a consequence or a behavior plan with the learners that will suit the both of you. Before we end, we're going to quickly look at some common mistakes that teachers make when they are disciplining in their classroom. Firstly, teachers attempt to discipline the whole class at once. So keeping the whole class in during break or after school will perhaps give the teacher a few minutes of calm and quiet, but it will not correct the poor behavior. And let's be honest, holding everyone accountable when only a few are misbehaving creates resentment and will damage your influence in the classroom. So when there's only one learner misbehaving, you need to hold them accountable and follow your discipline process. If there are 2 or 3 learners misbehaving, well, let's be honest, you need to become a more vigilant observer and monitor the learners more closely. When the whole class misbehaves, this becomes tricky, and a good way to address this is to revisit your routines in the classroom. If the class was wild and noisy while lining up outside your classroom, then get them to practice a few times how to line up. This reinforces what you expect of them, and instead of punishing them, you are using this opportunity to rather reteach a routine. The next common mistake we're going to look at is asking questions instead of giving statements. Often when a learner misbehaves, we tend to ask questions like, "Michael, are you supposed to be doing that?" Or, "Didn't I just give you work to do?" Or, "What are you doing?" As soon as you ask a question, you are opening yourself up for manipulation through unwanted discussions. Asking a question demands a response. And here's where learners drag out this interaction. "Oh, but ma'am, I was only doing this." Instead, give statements. Instead, when you see a learner misbehaving, you should approach them. Give them the statement. "It's quiet time now. You need to work on your own. Thank you." And then you need to turn and walk away. Your job as a teacher is to hold learners accountable for their behavior in the least disruptive way. The next common mistake is that teachers use too many warnings. A class is talking too loudly, and instead of dealing with the few rowdy learners that influence the rest of the class, the teacher says, "If you carry on talking like this, you're going to stay in 2 minutes at break." The class doesn't respond, so the teacher says, "Okay, you're now going to stay in 5 minutes," and so on. Giving the class a warning did nothing to get the desired behavior from the class. And remember, once you give a warning, you need to follow through with it if the behavior continues. Learners will soon pick up if you do not follow through on your warnings, and they will not take you seriously. If a teacher follows the discipline process and uses behavioral reminders, and adjustments, those are in essence giving learners another chance to improve their behavior. So then, why not skip the warnings and go straight to the consequences? The fourth mistake is not having a lesson plan that keeps learners on task. Although we have spoken about this in previous units, it really is so important. When teachers begin a lesson and they think they can just fly off the cuff, that's when problems arise. Bored learners will become restless and disruptive. The teacher then sees the class as being rude and disruptive and keeps them in at break. Now, is that really fair? Surely the disruptions arise from the teacher not being prepared. Every lesson needs to have a hook, something that will interest the learners and draw them into the lesson. There needs to be a variety of activities, or break up one activity into smaller tasks. You need to make sure you plan for extension activities and extend learners who finish early to keep them busy. You also need to support learners who are struggling with their work, because often if they do not understand what they are doing, they try and hide this feeling of inadequacy with rude or disruptive behavior. One possible solution is to get the learners who finish early to help other learners who are struggling. Now, these are all important elements that need to be looked at and considered for every lesson, and it's difficult to include all of these if you're just going to wing it in the moment. The last common mistake is that teachers take the learner's behavior personally. It's a difficult one because when a learner has a bad attitude, it's difficult not to feel disrespected. What we need to remember is that there is something going on with the learner, and the rude behavior is a call for help. Instead of getting our back up, you need to take the time to figure out how you would respond before you react. A simple phrase could be, "Hold up, that's not on, wait a minute." There are two important elements to remember. One, you don't want to distract time away from teaching and learning, so do not escalate the situation from a primary issue to a secondary issue, which is difficult when you are thinking, how dare this 14-year-old talk to me like this? But you must remember that. And secondly, your learners are watching you react. Always model the appropriate behavior and always preserve the learner's dignity. If you scold the learner in the moment with harsh words or sarcasm, you might have won the battle in the moment, but you haven't won the war, and the learner is sure to repeat that behavior again. Instead, address the learner and tell them you will deal with them in a minute or at the end of the lesson. Finish your teaching or get learners started on a task, and then talk to the learner individually. I hope you take all these elements into consideration when you devise and come up with your own discipline process or strategy for your classroom.